being here.
Of
Hey,
course.
so all of us grew up in the war on drugs era. Our Generation X, we're Generation Xers. It's a fantastic way to think about John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, act loop, and how not just our government, but many governments got inside of our orientation to shape the way we look at the world, specifically the world of psychedelic medicine, how we decide and how we act. And today, there's a lot of fifth generation warfare going on, trying to get in the minds of people using social media, using media to change the perceptions of a population. So I want to hear from both of you, Mark and Jesse, about how the fifth generation warfare, known as the war on drugs, affected your thought process in going into this psychedelic renaissance.
I'll start off. I mean, growing up in the 80s with shows like Miami Vice and other things, you thought that drugs were evil, they were bad, they were for people. You remember when I was 10, Len Bias died of a cocaine overdose, and he was going to play for the Celtics and allegedly be the next Michael Jordan. So I remember all those things and thinking that anything drugs was bad, but psychedelics to me, with an uncle that went to Woodstock and coming from a very interesting family background, I thought that that's what they did when they went to Fillmore East or when they went to Woodstock. And it was another, again, illegal drug that had murky, illegal drugs that had murky origins, and keeping those out away from innocent all-American kids like us that just wanted to play basketball or whatever. That was the way to do it. And the war on drugs was a very patriotic cause, I guess.
Yeah, I remember having the DARE program in elementary school, right? And we had this officer come in. It was like fourth or fifth grade, and this big jack dude with tattoos, super intense, and he was telling us about, like stay away from drugs, the normal spiel that we all kind of got. And then after a month, he no longer came, and it turned out that he had either an addiction problem or an alcohol abuse problem himself, right? And so it was like this first lesson of something's wrong here if like this is what they're teaching and this guy's struggling with his own thing. And probably, at the minimum, probably alcohol was involved as well, right? Because that's the acceptable for first responders, for us in the military. Work hard, play hard, don't talk about your problems, but drown them out as long as you can show up for the 5-mile run on Monday, right? So that's kind of the tradition you get into, and especially if you're high performing, that can really lend itself to, hurting your body, bad behavior. That was kind of situation I got in after the military of like, okay, well, went super hard and, hungover going into Monday, but still super productive. So what's the problem here? If I'm getting promotions and everything on the outside, I'm holding it together. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the psychedelics too, because not to get too much in the weeds, but you're mentioning sort of this control thing and the war on drugs, and governments or institutions have always used certain things to control the populations or how they think. And psychedelics or drugs has always been that sort of dynamic and what people can and can't read. So you go back to, hundreds, not thousands of years ago, like the church, for a while, they wanted to be the only one that could read the Bible. That's why it was written in Latin, right? And the Gutenberg press and the translation, these were huge revolutions because now the people had the word of the Bible. And it was the same sort of thing early on with indigenous tribes or that. They had this sort of their own access to spirituality or even some to the same version of the Christian God. But, that opens up the power, right? That limits the control. And so you see the same sort of stuff coming where there was noticeable fear in the 60s, 70s of the population becoming unruly, of questioning the establishment with the advent of the hippie generation, all this stuff coming out. There's arguments there of like abuse and all this other kind of stuff just because it did explode on the scene. But there's also in the U.S. been consistent history of the government using different drugs to control different populations. You can go back to Reefer Madness, and that was controlling a lot of African American and Mexican, putting them in this sort of diabolical content. And then later in the 60s, 70s, it was hitting the same sort of thing. Again, these drugs to control youth movements or African American, movements that were starting the civil rights sort of thing. And then the other dynamic is what you see with the war on drugs is it also gave us this geopolitical excuse to go into other countries as well and
Yeah.
have more governmental influence there. And so you see that across Latin America. So there's all these different things. It's not just drugs are
Mhm.
bad. There's these, multiple layers of how these have been used historically. And what we're taught is all drugs are bad. You do
Right.
drugs, you're either a druggie or you don't do drugs, right? And
Yeah.
that is across the board. And we even see that still now of heroin and fentanyl is lumped in with cannabis and psychedelics, right? And
Right.
that's just ridiculous.
So I want to talk about the warrior mindset, the warriors in general, and go back to our past, which is I joined the military in the mid '90s. We've been at war already for 5 or 6 years. Not a lot of folks knew that at the time. Spent the next 20 plus years in some type of capacity fighting a war somewhere in the world, which is a long time to be fighting wars. Mark, similar story. Jesse, your background. When did you come in the military?
Joined 2010.
Okay. So here we are fighting, I'm a Gen Xer, you're a different generation, I believe. But let's talk about what war is like and what other, civilizations did when they sent their warriors off to war and brought them back and what we lack in our society now. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jesse? What was life like in other civilizations?
Yeah, so I feel like I guess I fall more in the millennial dynamic. I got out
Mhm.
of graduated from college '09, joined the military 2010. We were already, pretty deep in both Afghanistan and Iraq at that time, and I went through Ranger Regiment, so kind of immediate, off the training straight to deployment as quick as possible. Um, and so being in that regiment, like you can see sort of the appeal, the old romanticism of it. Of in Ranger, you're surrounded by warriors, you're surrounded by the best of class, people who are just trying to get after it, who are super skilled, professional. When you see them in action, you're like, that person is meant to be a warrior. And I'm sure we've all seen that with many other people. Like this is what they're born to do. But at the same time, you have this complex, like these two wars going on with sort of dubious causes and why we're there, or at the very least, why we're still there at that point, right? And especially you saw with Afghanistan, it was the degree that we remembered that we were there triggered how many people we had over there. So I was kind of in the research of, oh yeah, we're here. Let's actually do something about it. Never an exit strategy talked about, right? And so you go over there, and so for me, that was kind of the biggest contrast of you had these people that had this calling, and they truly believe that they're, going after bad guys, and obviously that was a lot of the cases the people were going after and protecting the country, but that it was also coming into conflict with the longer we're there, why are we still here? And is this actually worth our time, worth the lives, worth the sacrifices that are being made? And at the same time, when we got back home, we would come like straight to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia, debrief, and then within an hour be in rowdy Savannah, super jacked, not having alcohol for the past 5 months, and then just, wreaking havoc on the town. There's no transition. It was just like straight back home. And also, you're in this population that's so disconnected from the war too. So you have all these sort of things that is very new in terms of a war kind of generation where they just feel isolated. There's no deprocessing, and that from different tribe, especially Native Americans, there was this thing where they'd stay isolated from their tribe before going back in, or you even saw this in World War II where they would park the boat off for a while or stop in Australia to kind of like the decompress before going back home. And so there's much more of this understanding of you can't just transition from super high on and then going straight into civility because it's just going to cause because you need to be a different person in both of those worlds.
Yeah. So what I understand is in other times, not necessarily in the U.S., but psychedelics were used to bring back the warriors to kind of decompress that recovery period, right? Because what they were doing in war and bringing that mindset back you didn't necessarily want in a civilization. So looking back at the history of psychedelic use, we discovered that even the church has used psychedelics in the past to help people recover. So we lost that. We lost that ability as a result, in my opinion, as a result of the war on drugs and maybe some other things that happened in our past. But can you talk a little bit about what you've seen as the founder of Heroic Hearts Project when it comes to other veterans accepting the idea of using psychedelic assisted therapy to help them recover from post-traumatic syndromes?
Yeah, so just the quick intro into it. I got out of regiment, was going into finance. Like I said, was doing well on the outside, but was not processing some of the things. And it was that transition period, right? Like, what's my purpose? What am I doing? Still kind of in this high intensity mode, not dealing with the lingering issues of being in that constant shuffle of deployed and high intensity training, going to like Excel spreadsheets, right? There was no real good transition there. And so you could see that sort of affect me, but hard headed took me a while to accept that. And I went to the VA. The VA was just sort of for a lot of us, once you get that stamp of PTSD, it's a life sentence. It's not taught that like oftentimes that you can get over this. It's just, okay, what's the medication that you need to kind of continue on? That didn't seem like the next best step. So I heard about these psychedelics. Because of this, I came into it when I first heard, or if anybody told me about mushrooms, I was like, yeah, okay, kind of had that fine for you, but like, I don't need to talk to the walls or my cat or anything like that. I don't see the benefit in this. But when I heard about this ayahuasca thing, this psychedelic that has this rich indigenous history in Peru, goes back thousands of years, it planted this small seed in my brain that it was different, which then allowed me to get past my dare sort of mentality. Because before, again, it was like you either do drugs and you're a drug user or you don't. And I had pride in not doing drugs. I didn't see like I had my vice in alcohol. So it was escapism, right? That's how I just viewed it all. And all drugs that it's all the same. So this ayahuasca thing, because there's this cultural thing, there was this dynamic to it. It allowed me to see it a little bit differently. Okay, this is not just me doing LSD at a concert, right? This is something different. And when there was no other options, and it was clear by that point that the professionals didn't really have a grasp on what was going on with me, that's when I was like, okay, what do I got to lose, right? Like unconventional situations need unconventional tactics. So went to Peru. Vastly different than anything that I was told psychedelics were. Was definitely not fun. Was definitely not, going to a concert with psychedelics. Very challenging, but then also had that reset. So that's why I started Heroic Hearts Project, because at that time there wasn't a lot of discussion about this in 2017, and I knew that at least for me, this could help. But then I also wanted to tell other friends, but then also provide them an access to it so that they just didn't end up in a random country getting there. And the reason I made this decision, which goes back to your question, is because I didn't tell anybody I was doing this. And then when I started reaching out to friends, and by that time I already lost double-digit people I served with to suicide, and people I knew in my network were on that fast track or barely hanging on. And when I talked to them, I thought everyone was going to be like, that's crazy. Like, are you doing drugs now? But instead, the reaction I got is like, that's crazy, but if it works, it works, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's like a very veteran mentality. Again, we plan every single contingency, but when you're on mission, you have to adapt to the situation on the ground. You have to use the tools on the ground. And this seemed like that sort of case of like, okay, I've never heard of it, but if it helps, then why not, right? And that seems to be a big sort of veteran kind of thing of like overcoming that. We're on a mission. Let's get to the end of the mission, unconventional way of doing it. And that really opened up that allowance of like, hey, this is something that veterans might be open to, even though veteran and psychedelic don't, initially seem to be aligned. And so that
Yeah.
was that start of Heroic Hearts. And early on, it was a little bit, getting the word out there, and slowly but surely, just because there wasn't prominent voice, but then really word of mouth, and then it just kind of spread like wildfire throughout the community.
So I want to talk a little bit about how PTS is actually developed, post-traumatic syndrome, and maybe Mark can help us with this as well on the OODA loop. So we know that our orientation shapes how we sense the external world, how we decide and act in it. And imagine we have you and I, or all of us, are part of an accident or part of a military um, event where something doesn't go as planned, and we all experience the same event, but the outcome is different for us. We all are traumatized by it differently. What I understand from some research from Dr. Paul Conti, Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, it's a book that came out about 4 years ago, about the time I was starting to become familiar with psychedelic-assisted therapy, is he calls this thing the multiple hit hypothesis, meaning that the three of us, we can, like I said, we can experience the same car accident or event overseas, but it will affect us in different ways. And that the way it affects us is based off of three things. It's based off our genetics, our cultural heritage or tradition, and our previous experience. So did we have another experience like that in the past, or is this the first time seeing something like that? So that multiple hit hypothesis means that, and I've heard this from friends too, and that is, how is it that you experienced this accident we had in 2003 or whenever it was, and so did they, but they had a different outcome, right? And it's just to show us that we're all different. We all experience the world differently. So that genetic heritage, that cultural tradition, that previous experience, that works in a way that shapes our orientation. And Mark, do you want to add any color to that on what Boyd was talking about with that?
Well, the nature of ambiguity, in that things have any one thing can be interpreted multiple ways. I mean, the three of us would be a really good example, right? We have the common experience of being veterans, but we have a Marine, Ranger Regiment, and we have fighter aviation from the Navy. I mean, those are three completely different worlds, and we could all intersect at certain points. But that experience and that frame of thinking that we have from those worlds is going to shape exactly how we see things. I think it's a massive advantage because, as Jesse was pointing out, I think veterans with that kind of thinking have an ability to quickly destigmatize things that are helping other veterans get these types of therapies. But that repository, that who we are, that what we think, what we believe, is going to shape how we see things, and every one event is open to multiple interpretations.
Yeah, and so I often use the term PTSD. I believe it's wrong. I think it's actually post-traumatic syndrome, right? I think there's multiple of them. That includes anxiety and a few other things. So PTSD, post-trauma syndromes, can arise from acute, chronic, and vicarious trauma, meaning that we could actually watch somebody, like a loved one, experience something, and we can internalize that trauma as well. So I guess my point behind all this discussion is really to kind of frame what's going on when a veteran or a first responder or a mother, a mom, a sister, brother, whatever it may be, experiences some type of trauma. It's built off of their past, their genetics, and the culture, which is pretty powerful. So within the military, within fighter aviation, today I even have friends that say, "Hey, I don't know. I'm perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with me." And I'm like, "Man, you're about as jacked up as anybody I know. You're crawling in a bottle every night." And then I have friends that, and Jesse knows Slider, Mark Keller. His story is pretty amazing. Having given the opportunity or blessing, or however you want to phrase it, getting him help to go down to Mexico and sitting down with him in San Diego, and him revealing his scars on his arms. And this is a buddy I went through officer candidate school with, I lived with when we were in flight training. And to see somebody who is one of your best friends reveal to you that for the last 20 or 15 years, many events have traumatized him, including the events that traumatized Slider, which goes over to Iraq and release of a weapon over there, and more events too. So, Jesse, can you walk us through what the current status is on veteran suicide and what the numbers are, so you can frame this in a way where people can start to maybe listen to veterans a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And to get even more complex, which like I think all these diagnoses are a good starting point, and they're like commonalities of symptoms often, but it's the starting point, right? So even if somebody has PTS, which the VA kind of does tend to rubber stamp after pretty humorous 20-question survey, but like a lot of the veterans we serve, a lot of the trauma stem back from childhood, right? Like childhood abuse, and then either makes them more susceptible to this, or the military stuff actually slides right off of them. So that's the other complexity of this, of like each person experiences trauma, but then there's a accumulation of many different traumas, and just to say you have this and therefore do this is kind of ridiculous, which we're trying to see right now. But yeah, so for us, with sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was the question again?
Just kind of frame the current condition, the current situation with
Yeah.
veterans suicide.
Yeah. So with the veteran suicide, the current statistics, and they tend to be all over the place, but I've seen the average tend to be between 17 and 24. I've seen some statistics making it all the way to 44 a day commit suicide. At the very least, more veterans have committed suicide on home turf by a factor of 15 than died in combat from the last 20 years from Afghanistan and Iraq.
And those are
the
those are
VA,
veterans. Those aren't just. I mean, I think there are active duty members that are not included in those numbers, right?
right? Yeah, generally
Okay.
that's just veterans.
And
But
it's
it's a
not
very, it's
just
very
the global war on terror too. These are Vietnam veterans that are doing it. These are,
Yeah.
you know,
yeah,
not just guys our age. They're guys that are older even.
yeah, and it tends to hit harder when you get to the 40, 50-year old sort of thing, which is also worrying, just because a lot of the younger generation are starting to get to that older age, which then, because of the natural like chemical changes in your brain, it makes you far more susceptible to a lot of that. But yeah, basically for the last, and this has been going on. This has been like a trend that has not decreased. If anything, a lot of years it increases, and the government has pumped in hundreds of billions of dollars into it and really have not found a resolution. And it's clear that for some SSRIs and these other medications can be quite helpful, but a huge percentage of those it is not. And just so the VA's own estimations, over 600,000 veterans have PTSD. I think it's a much bigger number than that, but those are the ones that they're treating. And if you look at the vast majority of those, they're going to be needing treatment for that for the majority of their lives. So there's really not, outside of psychedelics, which is why we're so excited about it, because they are so effective, but there's really not something on the pipeline behind it that's this magical cure all. And not saying psychedelics are either, because there's much more to it. It's the preparation, it's the integration, it's the psychedelic just unlocks it. It's a tool, but it's also having us rethink how we treat mental health, how we treat all this kind of stuff. So it is. We've been, a lot of the veterans ourselves and other amazing organizations have been at the front lines of this, trying to figure out, trying to help with TBI, trying to help with PTS, trying to help with suicide. And there's a lot of different tools out there, and it's just unfortunate that it always falls on veterans once again to help others without the support of the government funding. And you talk to politicians and you get the thank you for your service, but then you really don't get the follow up or actual
Yeah.
movement towards making
It can
some
take.
sort of change.
I think it's important to also frame and help people understand that PTS can take many different shapes and forms. You don't necessarily have to have been in direct combat, sticking, hand to hand bayonet fighting and that kind of thing. It could be pain from an injury sustained in training. It could be post trauma from sexual assault. Some of our sister veterans that have babies have postpartum stress. Sometimes people were killed in training accidents with insight. I mean, there's lots of things that can cause. So when we throw out big numbers, it doesn't mean we had that many guys on direct combat. No, it's a broad, it's a very broad sampling. I think of a very diverse way of places that you can get it.
Jesse, you don't just work with veterans too. You work with first responders. Is that correct?
We haven't really worked with first responders yet. I mean, we
Okay.
are moving to domestic access soon.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so in the future, we do want to work
Okay.
with first responders because it's very similar.
Yeah.
It's just right now the demand for
Yeah.
what we're doing is so high that
Yeah.
we just kind of have to focus on combat vets and military sexual trauma.
Okay. So we could focus on that now. The requirement is you can't do right now. You really can't do this in the United States. So our veterans that served our country and are often thanked for their service don't have access to this here in the United States. So your organization, and I want to make sure we talk about the legalities of this. What are we talking about here? We're talking about sending folks outside the United States where this is legal, right? Where they can have doctor supervision to actually go through um, the preparation, the setting, and the integration. Can you walk us through what that was like in setting it up to allow veterans to go overseas? And are you nervous about any? Um, yeah, what makes this legal? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's always nervousness and cautiousness from the beginning, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also the people we're working with had no other options and didn't have a lot of time. So it was almost ethical sort of solution, and I'd make all the same decisions again, right? If somebody's tried everything else out there and this could potentially help save their life, then why not give them that opportunity to go if it's their choice? And I can also provide better harm reduction and make sure they get to the right spot, right? So that was the other thing. If I was going to speak about this, I wanted to make sure people had the right framework. So really always was this facilitation harm reduction dynamic, not trying to replace the medical system, but a lot of these people, the medical system failed. And so, why not give them a compassionate one more shot or some other ways of going about this? And so that's really what we had to do, but also be as cautious as possible. Like, what do we need to consider? Contraindications, making sure that we're not just, it was never like the more psychedelics to the more people, problem solved. We were really diligent and still are about who we send. Right now, our intake process is 3 steps, including, evaluation of their health,
Mm-hmm.
physical, mental, medications, because we don't have the ability to mess up with this. We want
Right.
to make sure that people are getting the most out of it. So yeah, we make the way that we were able to work kind of almost a loophole where these are Schedule One substances in the U.S. So you
Mm-hmm.
can't
Yeah.
just use them, or you have to use them underground, or um, yeah, otherwise you're risking getting arrested, prosecution. There are countries that have indigenous dynamics of this that have been legal for a while. Peru, other countries, Jamaica now with mushrooms, and so they have legal ways of doing it. And so connecting, facilitating veterans going to these countries, going under places that have been doing this for decades with great supervision, safety, and the actual expertise in this, and then making sure that they have the safe passage there, preparation, getting there, and then coming back home.
Right.
That's kind of how we've been able to facilitate. Where the same thing, if you went to Europe that offered some sort of medical procedure that you didn't have here. So that's kind of what we've been able to do. But it's also, from my perspective, a huge embarrassment that our veterans have to go to other
Yeah.
countries to get life-saving treatment. And they've
Right.
done it in the thousands.
And to be clear, just to re-stress, because we did this on another podcast. We're not talking about the recreational use of these things. We're talking about the facilitated medical therapies to help people mitigate trauma that would otherwise lead to the things that you talk about, self-harm and suicide and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's only improved too as this has caught on, and the research backs it up, and more therapists are getting on board. Where in the beginning we really had to like extend our resources and find sort of the brave few that were because from a therapist standpoint, they can risk losing their license if they know that you're going to do this and work with you
Mm.
in some cases. But now that it's become more accepted that that risk is down, so early on, we had to be very conscientious of that. But now
Wow.
there's more of that continuum of care. So even if they do go overseas, there's many more therapists or much more help and infrastructure that then they can tap onto to continue their therapy or continue their healing and have a much more structured framework from that. And so that's the benefit of all this moving forward and getting to the US slowly but surely.
Can you share the numbers that are coming through Heroic Hearts Project? I talked to Doc Polanco about this a while ago too. His numbers were pretty amazing. But what are your numbers right now? How many veterans are actually going through this a week or month, a year? Where are we at right now?
Yeah, to date, so we've been operational for 7 years. We've served over 1,000 veterans in terms of getting treatments overseas. We also do spouse support. So we merge with an organization called the Hope Project. So we do essentially full family support. So we've served over 300 spouses just with like coaching. So every spouse gets a coach. And then we've served a few dozen in terms of their own retreats. So we're ramping up the retreats for the spouses as well. It all depends on the economy and the economics because we're a nonprofit. So we try to do multiple retreats a month, and then that serves anywhere from 20 to 40 a month. We have the capacity to do more, but there's still a cost with every veteran involved. So it's just I'm out there dancing for dollars to make sure we hit those numbers.
And does the veteran have to pay for this, or how does that work? What can you get? Like, if I wanted to go with you next month, how does that work?
Yeah, generally, and this tends to be across the board from most of the spots you're doing for these bigger programs, whether it's ibogaine, ayahuasca, or psilocybin. On average, they tend to be 5,000 to 6,000 per person. The way we operate is we have veterans have some sort of skin in the game. So generally, we have them pay into the system a little bit, so that way, one, you're getting them to invest in themselves. Two, it's almost like a pay it forward of like, hey, you're not just getting this for free; you are paying into it. And it also gives that sort of responsibility. If they can pay more, then we do a sliding scale. A lot of them will cover like or what have you. But we also don't want somebody to have to decide between paying rent and saving their own life, right?
I think that's key. I didn't know this until a few years ago, but even retired 04s, 05s who are suffering from PTSD, and this is my experience, is they could not afford to do this, right? So we had to find money for them, and I know you do that too. But this is not to say if you need help and you reach out to Jesse and Heroic Hearts Project, we'll find a way to get you funded, right? I mean, is that true? We're going to find a way to get you down there or out of the US to help you out if you qualify. So don't be afraid of those numbers. And if you can't afford it, and this is my comment, if you can't afford it, pay for it. All right. Don't take advantage of the context. Don't take advantage of anybody and say, hey, look, I'm going to save a couple $1,000s. Take your fucking money out of your pocket and pay for it, dude. Sorry to say that, but I've seen people actually take advantage of the situation here. So, and sorry about that, Jesse. I just want to make sure that it's very clear that if you need help and you're qualified, we're going to figure out a way to get you funded, right?
My team and this community, we're working day and night to try to get more access to more veterans and figure out better ways to scale it, and it's coming. We're finally in this spot where there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not just me waiting, like saying, hey, wait for Pfizer to come up with a new drug in the next 30, 40 years. Like, this is coming, and a lot of us are working our asses off to change the stigma to make sure it happens. So it really is like, work with us, get coaching. There is hope for a lot of us around the corner. It's still going to take some time, but there is hope.
In the destigmatizing I've yet to see, and I'm not aware of any. I'm not saying that there's not, but a lot of guys like us that were not at the flag officer or general officer level, who are the former retired chief of staff of whatever service or commandants or chief of naval operator. I mean, are there any prominent admirals or generals retired or even active duty that are advocating this type of stuff, and who are they?
Yeah. You want to? So we were talking about General Steele earlier, and then we have General Zanakis.
It's getting there. It's especially
is it more though, because I guess why I asked that, again, we're about John Boyd, and in his stuff. This was a guy that was getting quashed by the establishment, sort of, Pentagon types. And I just wonder if, when you talk about things like psychedelics or neurodiversity or other things that are real issues, do these things, is there a lot of headwinds internally, I guess, or is there more hope in that respect?
There's far more hope, night and day, of that. So there are some prominent generals, admirals that have come out. There's many more that have gone through this treatment and are like quietly advocating behind the scenes, but just obviously having to protect some, of their own like family or security or whatever. I was just 2-3 weeks ago at a conference and had a sit-down conversation with the current undersecretary of the VA, Dr. El Nahal, and he was a proponent of, like, he's in it, like, he knew just as much as anybody that's been in it. He knew MDMA, he knew psilocybin. He's like, this is our goal. It's the VA, so there's a lot of headwinds, but like having somebody at that prominent level that is understanding of this, that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. Having these generals and all this kind of stuff. So the tide is turning. There still is the headwind. There still is a big education sort of thing. But we finally have the foundation of research, prominent individuals. We get called out from individuals within the VAs all the time just to understand how to better prepare for this. So internally, there's still going to be the stalwarts, the people that just be like, drugs. I mean, that's inherent. But the traction has been made is quite significant.
Hey, Mark, there's a General Martin R. Steele, Marine Corps, 3-star, I believe he is, that Jesse and I know, and he's out there quite a bit talking about this. And by the way, years ago, General Steele used to use the OODA loop to explain how businesses can win in this type of environment. So he's a huge advocate of this right now. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with his background, Mark.
No, I'll have to do more. I can think of a couple I knew that were doing radical things that were interesting that we're not allowed to talk about, but
yeah. And then
I guess the other thing too is so Jesse, when you see the opposition that comes from the quote unquote establishment, is most of it, this is drugs, this is the war on drugs, and or is it people that have haven't had the experience with PTS, that maybe they were in the military but far removed from people that had the veterans that had to deal with this thing? Is that what most of the opposition sounds like?
You're gonna get combinations. You're gonna get people that just like hard entrenched of like, drugs is just going to turn everybody into a hippie and, be the death of American capitalism. You still get those. But you'd be surprised too, like little by little, like there's new generations doing CBD and cannabis that you never thought would be the ones taking an edible, right? Like there is a changing perception that does happen over time. From a political standpoint, it depends. It's either that sort of knee-jerk reaction, or it's like what's politically viable for them, right? So if they feel like this is too risky, then they might not stick their neck out there. So there's that. From the political standpoint, it's all that risk assessment of like, is this going to hurt my career, or is this going to show I care about veterans? Can I play in between? From the other side, it's just really that education, but we've seen bipartisan support. So to the degree that even, like Crenshaw and a few other major Republicans have come in support of this. There's a big federal bill that was pushed. Some notable, like the Luttrells are in favor of this and have been supportive. Rick Perry, who's like, well-known Republican Texas governor. So there is that there. So there's some lines that
he's a veteran too, by the way.
Yeah.
He was a
pilot.
So
there's some lines it does fall under, but you can't just, because like we just had a bill in California and we just got as much opposition from maybe more conservative Democrats as we did from certain Republicans. Like some of the Republicans that you thought would never go for this did. Yeah. Some of the Democrats that you thought like this would be in their alley didn't go for it, And so we're seeing that, and I guess it's just what their capacity is. But a lot of it, what you do see with a lot of these trends, especially when we go through different states, it's really just a lack of education. And that's where the veteran voice really helps. If you have the veterans speaking about it, you show the actual statistics coming out of Stanford, Johns Hopkins, all this kind of stuff. the people who are willing to have their views challenged tend to come to that side.
Yeah, you've been on the Hill quite a bit to talk to different folks up there, and having a military background and connecting with the veterans that are serving our Congress right now. They're coming around to this, and I know Mark went up there a couple times, Slider went up there a couple times to talk to folks. Well, what's that? Can you walk us through what that's like to sit down with somebody who lived through the war on drugs, who pushed back on all of this, and now here's a story of a veteran who isn't a hippie, if you will, no flowing robes coming in there, just a decent haircut and an interesting story, telling them about what this did for them. Can you give us some firsthand experience, if possible, what that's like?
Yes, I've done a lot of speaking both on the Hill and then also in state. So you have like state senators, state representatives, and the state one's interesting as well, just because on that one you tend to get more access to the actual representatives, right? Because it's a little bit smaller scale. So that one you can actually like push the leverage buttons of like, hey, sir, ma'am, you say you support veterans. I'm giving you like this on a silver platter, like money, put your actions over your mouth, this kind of thing. So I think you can kind of like play that a little bit more on there, and we have like changed minds pretty significantly with it. And then on DC, it's a little bit more complicated. Sometimes you'll actually meet the representatives, but oftentimes you're meeting their staffers, or sometimes they'll come in and get debriefed afterwards. And then on the DC, it's really just like consistency, like consistent message, keep going after it, keep talking, know what like clear, concise ways that they can help in terms of bills and like what's the progress. Don't overreach. There's been an effort to not overly say psychedelics because that could get the knee jerk reaction, but maybe frame it in a different way, kind of thing. So that's all the political stuff that's beyond me, or I don't really have too much interest.
What is your preference instead of psychedelics? What do you use instead of that word?
What I forget what they're using now, but they'll focus on like either the actual substances, like the ones coming up are like psilocybin and MDMA, and just really focusing more the messaging on, hey, we're not trying to change policy around psychedelics, we're trying to change policy around these breakthrough therapies or these substances that have shown above and beyond results. So it's just kind of how you like, what's the thing that's grabbing the most attention? Is it the substance and the results, or is it the word psychedelic? And that's all just like political gamemanship. But yeah, I mean, you do see that where for a lot of them, especially that are open, that really do sincerely want to help the veterans. And it's not just like a slogan that they say that, it's a passing phrase. They're a lot, especially early on, that they're like shocked of like, oh, this is not what I expected. This is interesting. I'll look into it. And that's all we can ask, right? If they just look into it and see what it's there, then that's a huge victory. And there's been a lot of, I just go there occasionally, but there's been a lot of others who have been doing amazing work, and they're just, consistently pushing that message. And it has, this last trip I was there, it really has changed the perception of psychedelics from the first time on the Hill where people were just like, what are you doing? Like, what's going on now? To now, a lot of the members in both the House and Senate actually have some degree of knowledge of this. And a lot of them are actually somewhat open to it, or at least we're getting there, right? And that's this whole thing of normalization. The more we talk about it, the more it becomes a public discourse, the more the average American talks about it, the less scary and the less of a big jump it seems. And that's really this process that we're in. And that's just more consistency of message, keep grinding down and keep getting that. But it is cool to see those that are willing to be open to hearing. There's some that are just straight up politicians, and, like you can kind of see that veneer, and you talk to them and you're like, is this a real person? But there's others that you can tell that their heart's in it.
It seems ironic too. If we were talking about psychotropics or psychoactives, no one would care. Like, it's like you can do that, and you wonder. I've always wondered in veteran suicides. Were they on psychedelics or were they on psychoactives? Were they on antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, things like that? It seems like those oftentimes have a much more common a common correlation. Whereas it seems from what I've learned of psychedelics is that they're not addictive. They don't have They don't have the damaging and lasting effects that those drugs can have, or even alcohol. Alcohol is the most pervasive drugs that's in all of our service songs that we sing about. It's on, the salute to the military from, liquor companies and things like that. And the deaths of alcohol versus psychedelics, I would bet that there's a wide disparity. I bet psychedelics are probably like this, and alcohol is the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the actual statistics of like, let's go with mushrooms or something like that. Like, I don't know if there's anybody who's ever been recorded as dying of an overdose from mushrooms. They might have a really bad experience, but there's always like you're gonna throw it up before you even can get to that level. It's not the same across the board, but generally speaking, a lot of the organic or the plant based like psychedelics, you can't overdose from them. And they've actually, to certain doses, like anything in moderation, actually show to have beneficial or benefits to physiologically as well. So, I mean, we're doing studies that there's actually repairing the brain from certain psychedelics, that restoring gut microbiomes. There's a lot of main health issues that people are actually looking at for psychedelics beyond the just psychoactive or psychiatry sort of thing. And yeah, to your point, SSRIs or psychoactives. If you look at the what's the first negative reaction or whatever you call it, and it's always like increased suicidal ideation. It's like the commercials where they just list like, like your stomach's gonna explode and breathing out blood out of the nose and all this kind of stuff. So I mean, a lot of those.
Yeah. Well, again, this is maybe it's just the Gen X skepticism, right? But I'm a season ticket holder of an NFL team, right? And I go to games, and I've never would think that anybody that I see causing fights and things are the drug that they're always on. It seems to me is alcohol, not psychedelics or that kind of a thing.
Yeah. And that's and there is the caution of like, and that's what we say, like, don't take this in your own hands. Like, go with a support system, because they can be extremely helpful with PTS, but if you have a lot of trauma, you're also opening up this Pandora's box potentially. And so you need to have a support system. You need to know what you're getting into. And if you just take this in your own hands, then it can be, somewhat risky, because then you're just like, what the hell was that? Now I have to deal with all these emotions that I've been, stuffing in a box for the past 20 years.
I want to talk about the dark side of psychedelics, and maybe and before we get to that, I want to point out something that just popped up on my radar today, and it's a new book called Trippy: The Peril and Promise of Medicinal Psychedelics. It's by Ernesto Londono, I believe it is. Points out 5 things in today's quick brief here. The third thing he points out is veterans are on the front lines of psychedelic renaissance. That's what we talk about. We know that. But there's another element in here that we need to look at, and that is the hype outpacing the science? And we've had some folks on here as well to look at that. I want to go a little bit deeper. Where has this gone wrong in your experience, and what are the barriers to this going forward? What's going to prevent in our world? What's going to prevent this from happening where we have access in the U.S.?
Yeah, Ernesto's actually a friend. He was we had he was a New York Times reporter, and he joined us at a retreat back many years ago. So I'm glad his book's getting out there, and it is notable cautions of what needs to come. And so this is sort of the dark side that we are seeing, and I'll qualify it afterwards as well. But like I said, these can be very beneficial for trauma. But if you have a lot of trauma and you just take it, people who are at desperation, it really can, leave you somewhat open-ended, or like, that's why we do 4 to 6 weeks of preparation. Because if you're not in the right mindset, that's where people get into this bad trip. And I really do think it's a big factor of preparation or selection too, because some people just don't think are ready for it. And so this bad trip dynamic is when a very intense journey then brings new trauma or traumatizes the person even further, right? Like they just get caught in this hell, or they get caught in this reoccurring sort of trauma state. And again, there's ways that if people are prepared, that we really avoid that. And challenging trips can actually be quite beneficial, but that's not discounting that there's no case where it can just be, super intense and super hard to deal with. But a lot of that's interpretation that you can help people get through. The other side of it is, this is people are vulnerable in that spot. You are
Mm-hmm.
taking something that takes you out of your normal conscious state,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to be in a trusting environment, trusting container. Or when you're working like with MDMA therapy, which is coming down the pipe, it opens you up and it makes you very connected and emotionally available and trusting. And if the therapist is at all um, in violation of anything, like that can be a hard dynamic, right? Like there can be people overstepping barriers and unwarranted touch and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a new way in a lot of ways of treating mental health that does open people up. And because of that, it can be quite effective, but that also opens up people to being more vulnerable. So we do need to have those conversations and make sure a lot of this is thought out and the proper safety mechanisms are in place. And the same sort of thing, psychedelics can increase people that already have like megalomania or high
Mm-hmm.
egos. It can increase that. That's why I've never been a believer that everybody should have psychedelics and it's just going to make
Right.
them better. For some people, it gives them this like sort of godlike complex, or they're already probably inclined to that, but it can just make it
Yeah.
worse. And so, there are a legitimate, like churches and all this kind of stuff that have been using psychedelics as sacrament for quite a while. But that does open up this dynamic of people using this from spiritual or religious perspective as the tale as old as time of what are you going to use to take advantage of people and
Mm-hmm.
control them, right? And this is just there's many other tools out there. This is just another one that we have to be cautious. But the way I'll qualify this is, one, a lot of these things are worse when they're underground. When
Yeah.
we talk about them, bring them above ground, it makes them safer because there's actually conversation about it. If I talk to you, I'm not at risk of being declared a criminal. If there's pipelines for people to do it safe, of like, hey, this person is trusted, noteworthy, there's forums about it, this person's not. When it's underground, it's so hard to call out the bad players. And then all
Mm-hmm.
this other infrastructure of support that if somebody has a very challenging experience, we know what we're doing and we know where to get them. So bringing this above ground, these are cautions that we shouldn't go back to know. These are cautions that, hey, this is going to get safer if we play it intelligently. The other side of things too is we were in this, because of the war on drugs, we're in this artificial state where we do have to, there's some hype that needs to happen. We wouldn't be here talking about this, trying to push the research forward independently if it wasn't for the war on drugs. Like if the system worked, if it wasn't broken and preventing people from effective treatments for the last 50 plus years, then it could go smoothly, it could go efficiently, but we're not in that ideal system. So there is this balance of, yeah, maybe it's a little bit overhyped, but in some sense it needed to be overhyped to also break through some of the artificial restrictions. So the things to watch out for, though, is there can be a big backlash. If there are these cases of people doing crazy stuff on psychedelics or whatever, the media really, you can save 1,000 people and it just takes one person to have some sort of crazy story that the media latches onto and it
Right.
derails it, because that's what feeds the news cycle, right? Not the people that saved. So that's what we need to be very conscientious that if we are doing this, and again, it's not a numbers game, it's a quality game and it's an infrastructure game. So now that we're finally paying attention, that's where people need to look out and also be, as veterans, we need to look out for each other. If somebody's doing something in an inappropriate way or they're taking advantage of the system, then we need to call that out. It's the same thing in the nonprofit space of, we've probably all come across nonprofits that were just not necessarily doing their tasks or just, getting money off of it. And there's
Yeah.
not good infrastructure to report that, right? And so we need to protect our own and make sure that people are doing this in the correct way.
I'm wondering about the pharmaceutical industry. What do they think about this? And Mark and I've had discussions about this with other guests. We know a lot about the military industrial congressional complex where we build things that cost a lot of money and we don't get a lot of value out of them. So the incentives of the system drive the behaviors, and there's incentives behind keeping people on medicines or drugs. We'll just call them drugs for now. If you find something, you can, if you find an illness, you can create a drug and then keep a person on that drug. So that, just kind of giving some context for the pharmaceutical industry, how they make money. If the pharmaceutical industry was interested in psychedelics, can they make money off of it, or would they lose customers? I want to get some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's tricky, and that's actually been sort of evolution in the psychedelic space since I've been in. And actually, one of the things, and it's for good and for bad, right? So there's this organization called Compass. They were a nonprofit. They really started pushing psilocybin for depression. They started out as a nonprofit. They ended up to be a for-profit. They got a lot of flack in the industry. One, just because there's kind of a pushback of, these things that are natural and should be available to everybody, anybody trying to make profit off of it. On the other side, because they became like a billion-dollar company, that caused this huge influx of capital into the space, brought more attention, brought more funding for different sort of innovations and possibly nonprofits as well. And so it's kind of the dual-edged sword, right? Like there's bad stuff about it because people thought they took advantage of the goodwill with a nonprofit and then put patents on it. And that's the other thing. You can't patent a mushroom, but they patent the process of synthesizing it so that it could still make money. So there's ways of doing it, but it's this fine dance of like, is it just going into a system where now it's going to be so expensive that you can't even access it unless you have insurance? And then we're in the same sort of game where underserved communities continue. So that's kind of been the dance with the psychedelic space. I'd say from the big pharma, I haven't really heard too much from like the Pfizers or anything like that. There can always be some of the, behind the scenes lobbying from Congress side or the FDA side, but nothing super notable. And then in terms of like big pharma, this tends to go more into the bio, like smaller, like startup biotech companies that will, again, try to find the same, like psilocybin, you can slightly alter the formula. And then if that new formula, you can prove that it helps this or this treatment, then you can patent that formula, right? So there's a lot of them trying to do that, or the process around it. And there's different ways of that. But at the end of the day, from my perspective, all that's just proving that the mushroom in the ground works. And then as long as you're not preventing me from having a more cheap access community care model, then you guys can go try to make money there, and I'll do this. But a lot of these substances, similar with cannabis, they're grown, so they're not patentable. But that kind of goes to a bigger issue too, beyond sort of the pharmaceutical complexes. Our medical systems, our insurance systems, the FDA are not built necessarily for cures or for things that are not profitable, right? So the way you get through the FDA is by spending hundreds of millions of dollars on clinical studies, double blind, all this kind of stuff. Super expensive. But the reason it doesn't necessarily help with cures is because unless you charge an arm and a leg for that cure, it doesn't make sense for a Pfizer to invest in it, right? And so that's the problem why this has all been crowdsourced of MDMA going through that, because it's not patentable. So it's not going to be the $1 billion paycheck for a Pfizer to do it. And so you really miss out on a lot of things that could actually be significantly better, or you don't need that much. But if there's not that economic model for it, then it just can't go through the FDA unless you get more nonprofit money. And the same thing with insurance. The way the insurance model works, the case in point is ketamine. Ketamine has been generic for a while and super cheap. And more recently, in the past few decades, they've shown that it has really beneficial effects for some mental health things. So, in the military, we use ketamine for anesthetic, like loss of limb, you put that on in the hospitals. But it can also have an immediate antidepressive effect, immediate anti-suicidalation. And they've been using with therapy quite effectively off-label. But again, it doesn't make sense for you to go through the FDA to prove that main ketamine is beneficial for PTSD, because that would cost you tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for something that you can't make money. And so Johnson, the company, slightly tweaked the formula of ketamine, got it through the FDA for depression, I believe. And now that's the main, now far more expensive, essentially the same sort of chemical, but now they can charge much more. That's the thing that gets accepted by the VA. That's the thing that gets accepted by insurance. Where genetic ketamine, which is like cents on the dollar compared, it won't get covered by insurance necessarily. So there's this weird dynamic with the system where it encourages these extremely lofty prices and not necessarily cures, unless you can find economic incentive for it.
And I just want to point out today, the FDA approved feed ingredients to cut dairy cow methane emissions. Here we are talking about saving the lives of veterans, and somehow, some way that this, okay, we want to make sure cows reduce their farts, I guess, whatever. So money drives a lot of things here,
priorities.
Yeah. It's the incentives that are driving the whole system, as Jesse pointed out. We absolutely agree with that. Jesse, talk to us about what's going to happen in the United States in the near term. What's possible? Where can people actually go?
Yeah, so this is the most exciting thing for us. So the past 7 years, like I mentioned, we've been sending people overseas to all sorts of different countries to get them these sort of treatments. Finally, last year, we did the first ever in the U.S. legal veteran retreat with psychedelics, which is pretty significant, and that was in Oregon. So Oregon and Colorado both passed laws. Colorado comes online next year officially. Oregon just came online this year after they passed their policy. And it allows essentially government health authority approved access to psilocybin treatments in the state. And it's going to be, supervised by therapists and helpers, and there's all these different regulations. But it is the first time people in the U.S. can access a psychedelic through legal above ground means. It is a state's right versus a federal right. So there's still psilocybin still federally illegal. And so that causes some stuff, but there's very good assurance of, like, if you do it in Oregon, like, the cops are not going to, like, it's a states' rights issue, and there's a lot of legal backing of that. The other dynamic, so for us, that's huge because, one, that brings it back here, so we can really reduce costs. We can bring it more to a community, and that's what we're building. We're really trying to expand in Oregon and Colorado and then the rest of the U.S., where not only do you have access to these treatments, but then you also have other veterans, other first responders that have gone through this, that are your coaches, that are your facilitators in your hometown that you can regularly meet up with. And so rebuilding these sort of fallen community structures, because I don't know, my generation, I don't know about the Gen Xers, but we don't really go to VFW or American Legion anymore. Doesn't mean it's beyond the pale, but we've really lost these community centers for veterans. And I think because we don't want to go to, like, a smoky old bar and just swap war stories, like, if there's some place that actually encouraged us to, have, do better stuff, wellness, all this kind of stuff, I do think there's that need, because every time we get veterans together, it's just this palpable sense that they were missing it, right? Sometimes we avoid other veterans, but, like, when you get them together, they share the jokes. It's that in itself is therapeutic, and there's just not the infrastructure for that. The other big thing that should be on radar is MDMA. So MDMA is the chemical component of ecstasy, but that's been going through the FDA trials. It's actually shown quite phenomenal results. 67% of patients that had treatment-resistant PTSD, so the hardest of the hardest, like the cases that nothing else was working on, 67% after going through FDA MDMA trials no longer had PTSD. So that's a huge jump from anything else out there. And that's not to say the other, 33%, they also, a lot of them, a big portion of them got benefit. So it wasn't just that all or nothing.
Okay.
So that they went through all the FDA trials. The FDA has to finally make a decision early August of whether it will be an approved medication for PTSD. We have pretty good expectations that it will, just based off of how good the results have been. And if that's the case, then all of a sudden that's going to reclassify it. And then that is going to lead to a domino effect of MDMA potentially being available through the VA, through insurance, through clinics. And that's also going to be a great benefit. So what we see is parallel tracks, possibly starting the end of this year, of going through a clinic or the VA, and hopefully you get access to MDMA, or if you want to be have more ceremonial or traditional community access, then you'll have community access to psilocybin, and both can be, send messages differently. Both can be great healers. They're not mutually exclusive, but it is finally opening up effective mental health to not only veterans, but the rest of the population.
What about active duty? And I bring this up because I had a conversation with Dr. Kaufman a couple of years ago where they were looking at possibility of allowing active duty members to go through a MDMA trial. Are you tracking any of this?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's just one of those like hot topic issues. But I mean that is the case of like that. Then that's going to be growing discussion, right? Like why do? Because when I was in, there's platoon sergeants and sergeant majors who were clearly on that PTS spectrum. Like if you looked at them wrong, then you'd have fear of your life, right? And they were just kind of in this, like, they could make it happen with that nonstop deployment cycle, but the moment things settled down, just kind of went crazy. So there's that question of like, why does it make better warriors to address their trauma earlier, right? Before they get to those bad cycles or the bad habits or substance abuse or what have you, and make sure their family life is better. But then the other side of it too, which is sort of the tricky of like, is there a component, does this make them a better warrior, or will it make them rethink their service or their relationship with going over battle? Is there the potential of, lessening the forces in terms of that? And so that's kind of, and then just from a PR standpoint, it's a really hard political stance to, when somebody can say like, oh, you're dosing active duty soldiers with psychedelics, right? Like there's a bad history of that. And so anything that has that sort of association is just going to be a tricky sell from a political standpoint. So I think first, let's just prove out that it helps with PTSD, and there are models. And then I think there is the case where I think especially MDMA, first and foremost, will be increasingly accepted for active duty in the coming years.
Have you looked at how this could potentially help in performance? I know that athletes are using it to build out better performance, actually become better people, which leads to better performance. Have you looked at anything that's happening in the military or outside the military for actually creating higher performance in individuals and teams?
Yeah, to some degree. Nothing like military specific in terms of military funding. The main study with the military is trying to create, the DoD is trying to create psychedelics. So just trying to get like the anti-inflammatory and other sort of things. But there is, from my perspective, a benefit of the actual journey to help you out psychologically. But these things are so they're hitting our brains and our bodies in such unique ways, and they're allowing people to heal in so many unique ways that it's really this beginning renaissance stage of what they will reveal for how the brain processes, how we process trauma, what is trauma, all these kind of things that we just kind of have very black and white answers for, which is why our treatments have been so ineffective. And so I do think it's going to open up all sorts of better understanding, including performance. And, because you don't need to be super traumatized to benefit from psychedelics, right? Like it can just be quality of life or better connectivity or sort of resetting. And so there's a lot of things that are still unknown about how the brain works that I think these will help. But then there's other things of like performance, the studies around microdosing, because psychedelics do enhance your perceptions in a lot of ways. It makes you more sensitive or increases your senses in a lot of ways. So that could potentially be beneficial. And then just the very basic, if you are an athlete or what have you, and if there is trauma or there's self-doubt or what have you, there's ways of framing this that it can help you better connect and keep that motivation. So I can see it across the board. Again, there's a lot of openings to, charlatans taking advantage of that and, selling snake oil, but there's absolutely ways that it can be used to benefit in a variety of different ways.
If our listeners want to send some money your way to help with your nonprofit, how do they do that? Is that possible?
Yeah, so like you said, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. All donations are, provide a tax write-off And the way we are able to serve veterans, and there's more and more knocking on our door every day, is through generous donations. That's how we get them to this life-saving treatment, because unfortunately there's currently not government support for that. So our website, heroicheartsproject.org. There's a big donate link. We are on the major social medias like Facebook and Instagram. So Heroic Hearts Project. So if you are open to helping a vet, it costs about $6,000 per vet, and we really do appreciate any support. It doesn't need to be to that level. It can be, every little amount helps. So we do appreciate that, and really helping us change the game for veterans seeking this kind of care.
Well, I really appreciate you being here with us, Jesse. I know. I think the first time you and I met, you and I saw Mike Tyson talk about 5-MeO DMT for 20 minutes straight with Daniel Carcillo. It's kind of funny, actually. But that was 3 years ago down in Miami. Yeah. So, are you doing any events like that? Do you do any public speaking at those events still?
Yeah, occasionally I'll go. Just proof of life that I'm still out and active. You got to show your face every once in a while. No major events coming up right now. We will be doing like a big charity gala in LA. We'll send it out through our website. People can sign up for the newsletter, and then if people have communities that they think will be very supportive, we always like throwing together small dinners or informative events in different cities where we think that there might be donors or just better education. So if people have an opportunity for that, we're happy to put together our heads and figure it out.
No, we appreciate you coming on. It's good running into you the other week at a psychedelic event. It was very nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for giving this a voice, guys. Always good to see you.
One thing I would say about that event and others around here in Manhattan, where both you and I are, is I've been really taken aback and delighted at the interest in helping veterans. It seems to be widespread and sincere and genuine from people who have never been in the military. So it's really encouraging.
Yeah. We've been very blessed and honored by the support that's out there. And, I think it's a testament to a lot of the actual country, the Americans, maybe not, again, always followed up by the politicians, but there are many people that are embarrassed and shocked that veterans have to go to other countries, and they've been the ones that are helping us. So it's cool to be in a time, in a generation, in a country that really is supportive, and they're willing to put their action behind their words.
Yep. Outstanding. Thanks again for coming on and joining us, Jesse. Really appreciate it.
Of course, guys.